Today on Earth Focus, biodiversity. The world's species are disappearing at unprecedented rates. The consequences for human health are likely to be enormous. Coming up on Earth Focus.
Biodiversity is a way to describe the sheer variety of life on Earth.
Life on land, air, and sea. The sheer diversity of life on Earth is a testament to the majesty, beauty, and wonder that is the natural world. Millions of species of plants, animals, and microorganisms, and the environments they inhabit are part of a greater interrelated system, where life forms depend on one another for survival. Human beings are part of this intricate web of life. Biodiversity is also a source of cultural and spiritual wealth, an essential part of human tradition and inspiration. The Earth's natural systems provide a range of services that are vital to our survival. We depend on other species for our food, livelihood, medicines, as well as to purify our air and water. Oceans provide food and help regulate climate. Forests regulate water supplies and provide fuel. But all too often, we take these services for granted. Today, human actions are pushing natural systems to their limit, and this, scientists say, can undermine not only the quality of human life, but human survival itself.
We probably don't know the names of about 95% of everything living in the ocean, so most of the life in the ocean has never been studied by a scientist.
There may be 100 million microbial species. There may be 1 billion microbial species. Nobody has any idea about that whatsoever.
Most of the world's biological diversity is found in the world's rainforests and coral reefs, and new species continue to be identified. Deep ocean environments, in particular, offer tantalizing new prospects for discovery of unknown forms of life. No one knows how many species exist on Earth. Scientists have named and cataloged just over 1 million species. What we do know for certain is that we are losing species at an unprecedented rate. Losing species before we even knew they shared our planet.
The variety of life is going down quite rapidly.
It's going to change the nature of our cultures, the natures of our cities, and how we go about our daily lives.
In Earth's history, there have been 5 mass extinction events, the last of which occurred 65 million years ago.
There was this massive extinction from an enormous meteor, asteroid that hit the Earth, that caused tremendous debris to go up into the atmosphere, cooled the planet for a long period of time.
Half of all species went extinct, including the dinosaurs. The rate of species lost today is on par with that event, and it is by far and away the highest rate of species loss since humans have been around. The rate of species lost today is probably at least 100 times that which occurred before humans were around. And for many groups of species, the rate is nearer to 1,000.
Today, that mass extinction is caused by one species, man.
We're on pace to lose 50% of species by 2100, largely due to habitat loss and climate change.
The major danger is habitat destruction, because each species has very special habitat requirements, and once you destroy those, you destroy the species.
We are cutting down our rainforest at an alarming rate. We're overfishing in the oceans. We're consuming natural resources at an unsustainable rate.
half of the Earth's surface has already been altered by humans. 3/4 will be altered in the next 30 years. Pollution from farms, pesticides, and fertilizer runoff is causing dead zones in lakes and seas. 80% of the world's fisheries are depleted, overexploited, or in a state of collapse. 1/3 of all coral species are at risk of extinction.
I think we are definitely a big pest on Earth as far as the Earth is concerned, because we are destroying so many ecosystems.
And climate change will make an already bad situation worse and could become the factor most responsible for species extinction in the next century.
Roughly 30% of land-based species are at risk of extinction from climate change alone by century's end.
Nobody knows what that's going to mean. Clearly, tremendous problems with food, tremendous problems with water, tremendous death of species of all kinds, heat waves everywhere.
The big challenge to reefs is the role of carbon dioxide, which both heats up the ocean and it makes it more acidic. 2 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree centigrade causes something called coral bleaching, and that is, if serious and prolonged, can lead to massive amounts of coral death. And the second thing that carbon dioxide does is it dissolves in the ocean and makes the ocean more acidic. And in a more acidic ocean, it's much harder for organisms to secrete their skeletons. And so corals have a much harder time doing what they're supposed to do.
And you can quickly realize how warming of the planet and changing the way the water cycle on the planet works, which are 2 of the consequences of greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change, could affect the ability of species to live. For one thing, cold-blooded species have to maintain their body temperatures by staying out of the heat. And if it's getting warmer, that forces them to move. And in fact, right now, we're living through a mass migration of species towards the poles of the planet, those that can get out of the heat.
The most important thing to understand about biodiversity is not that individual organisms are important, but that they persist in an ecological web that is interactive. And the loss of one species leads to ramifications on others.
Scientists now say that the high rate of extinction we are experiencing today could reduce nature's ability to provide food, clean water, and a stable climate.
What we really need to do is sort of wake up as a species, understand that this planet actually works not just as a physical system, but as a linked biological and physical system. Recognize that it is absolutely fundamental to our existence.
Biological diversity plays an important role in medicine. Plants were known for their healing properties for thousands of years. As early as 2600 BC, the Mesopotamians used oils from cedar and cypress trees, licorice, myrrh, and the opium poppy to treat ailments. Ancient Chinese, Egyptian, Tibetan, and Indian Ayurvedic medicine all prescribed drugs that were mostly plant-based.
If you're on a medication, particularly for cancer or an infectious disease, it's a very good chance that those medicines which are saving your life wouldn't exist if it weren't for nature.
Most of the medicines we take are made in laboratories today. Their inspiration, their design, and their discovery has historically relied very heavily on molecules that we've discovered in plants, animals, and microorganisms.
This includes drugs like the statins, which are widely used all over the world, and certainly insulin is a natural product.
There's something called Zoravax, which is used against herpes. That comes from a marine sponge. And then there is also an anti-cancer agent that comes from sea squirts.
The rosy periwinkle, a plant found in Madagascar, revolutionized treatment for Hodgkin's lymphoma and acute leukemia. The anti-malarial drug quinine was found in the bark of a tree in the Amazon rainforest. The painkiller morphine was isolated from the opium poppy. Aspirin was synthesized from compounds found in the bark of the white willow and the plant meadowsweet.
Today, the first-line treatment that we have for malaria, one of the world's biggest killers, is based on a plant from China, and that is now our first and currently our best line for controlling this tremendous disease.
If you look at all of the new drugs that were approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration between 1981 and 2006, almost 2/3 of those would have had their origins in nature, not in a lab. And what's even more interesting is that oftentimes nature gives us molecules that may not make it fully through FDA trials, but teach us a tremendous amount about how our bodies work in health and disease. One example would be there's a drug called rapamycin, and this drug is used in transplant patients. It's also used on so-called coronary artery stents. These are little mesh tubes that get put into the blood vessels that supply the heart with oxygen, and they're put in after people have heart attacks and the artery gets clogged off. Rapamycin comes from a soil microbe on Easter Island, and it has become incredibly useful. But it turns out that its value to medicine is far greater than as a drug. We were able to understand a part of how our cells know when to divide because of this drug. So there's a protein in every cell that is called the molecular target of rapamycin, or mTOR for short. And we only discovered this protein because we found this molecule in nature. And this protein is a gatekeeper for when the cell knows when to divide. And so sometimes, because nature works through trial and error as it tries to figure out how to deal with all the challenges that come up, it can come up with solutions or molecules that no rational person might conceive of. And those sorts of innovations can be tremendously valuable to medicine, like rapamycin.
Penicillin was derived from a mold to become a widely used antibiotic to treat diseases like syphilis, as well as staph and strep infections. Another antibiotic, vancomycin, was developed from a fungus found in a soil sample in the jungles of Borneo.
We found some of the venoms from snakes have given us the ability to understand how to freeze specific neurological cells, and in some cases those provide therapeutic agents.
Particularly the stuff that lives glued down to the bottom of the ocean is a rich source of potential medicines, because those organisms can't move. That means they have to defend themselves by being nasty to eat, and the things that make them nasty to eat are often actually in small amounts very helpful to us in terms of developing medicines. One of the best examples in terms of medicines are the cone snails, where there are about 700 species of cone snails, each of which has somewhere between 100 and 200 specialized poisons that they use to capture and kill their prey, and only a handful of them have been looked at for medicine.
These chemicals made by cone snails are being investigated for new medicines. There are clinical trials for new drugs for epilepsy. There are clinical trials for drugs that will protect nerve cells during strokes, heart cells during heart attacks, and one of these chemicals is on the market now. It is the most important painkiller that's been discovered essentially since morphine in the early 1800s. It is 1,000 times more potent than morphine. It's based on one of these cone snail poisons, just one. It's called Prialt. And it's being used for patients who no longer respond to opiates. Some people believe cone snails may have more medicines that are important for humans than any other group of organisms on the planet. So with global warming, if we're destroying coral reefs, we may lose the most valuable pharmacopoeia on the planet.
When we lose species, they're gone forever. We can't buy them back into existence, nor can we discover these potential secrets that could be life-saving.
If people understood that better, I think they would behave very differently.
Today, amphibians are one of the most threatened species on Earth. Nearly a third are in danger of going extinct.
They're very sensitive to changes in their environment, poisons of various sorts, climate change, habitat destruction. If you've ever held an amphibian in your hand, you'll know that they feel moist and clammy typically, and that's because they breathe through their skin. And in order to do that, the skin is very thin and it's moist. It's used as an effect, a lung to some extent. And many of them breathe through their skin exclusively. There's some salamanders that only breathe through their skin. They also take up water through their skin. But as they do this, because they don't have a very effective barrier with the outside environment, and so they can absorb a lot of the toxins and chemicals that into their body very readily. There are now many well-documented studies that show that various chemicals which are commercially applied either as herbicides or pesticides, commercially in the context of agriculture, as well as in people managing their own homes and gardens. Many of them chemically are very similar to certain basic hormones in humans and other animals. And they are so close chemically to these naturally occurring hormones that they actually disrupt our normal endocrine balance in our body, hence the term endocrine disruptors. A very serious one is called atrazine, which at least, if not still, it was until recently among the most widely used commercially used herbicides in the world. It's known to feminize males. In other words, instead of producing a testis or a chromosomally male frog will develop not abnormal testes. In some cases, the testes will actually have follicles. They'll produce eggs. And this interferes. There's effects on their behavior. There's effects on their physiology and so forth. The frogs are very diverse. And they're species that have specialized in different ways, whether it's their breeding biology or their coloration and so forth. Scientists have discovered that the particular features that have evolved in one group or another have interesting pharmacological benefits for humans, and in some cases are or were being developed as potential drugs.
Researchers are looking at how compounds from amphibians can fight bacterial infections, as well as infections in people with weakened immune systems, including those with HIV/AIDS. At a time when antibiotic resistance among bacteria is becoming more widespread, scientists say amphibians may hold the key to both new antibiotics and to ways of overcoming antibiotic resistance.
There were two species of frog in Australia known as the gastric brooding frogs. They had one of the more bizarre reproductive biology. In this case, the female frogs would lay eggs externally, as most frogs do. The male would fertilize them externally, as is typical for frogs. But the female would then turn around and swallow the fertilized eggs into her stomach, where they would stay for several weeks, developing, and ultimately she would give birth orally. The frogs would just basically literally hop out of her mouth. And this immediately raises the question, well, gee, if most people or frogs take something into their stomach, it's dissolved, it's digested, it's used. How can these eggs stay in the female's stomach for weeks at a time, and embryos and little froglets for weeks at a time and not be digested? Well, as it turned out, studies in the 1980s begun by Australian biologists found that the tadpoles, the little larvae, were secreting a substance which inactivated the stomach lining, and it wasn't producing digestive enzymes. So it was inhibiting the stomach activity, enabling it to basically serve as a uterus. Well, there are some unfortunate syndromes in humans called ulcers involving the lining of the stomach caused by among other things, oversecretion of digestive enzymes. And these frogs were studied in the sense that hopefully or ultimately might provide some means of controlling human stomach ulcers. Well, where does the tragedy? The tragedy comes in that the species were only discovered in the 1980s and named, and within a few years they went extinct in nature. Ultimately, those animals died out, and the species is lost forever. Both species are lost forever, and they can't be studied any longer.
Melting Arctic ice is threatening the survival of the polar bear. And with the loss of the polar bear, may come the loss of potential medicines for diseases like osteoporosis, kidney failure, and diabetes.
Polar bears are essentially immobile, as every other hibernating bear is, for 5 to 7 months. And yet they don't get osteoporosis. Their bones do not thin. They are the only mammal that doesn't get osteoporosis with prolonged immobility. If we were immobile for 5 months, if we were hospitalized or paralyzed, we'd lose 1/3 of our bone mass. So with immobility, the balance shifts to losing bone, osteoporosis. This is an enormous public health problem in the United States and in the rest of the world. 70,000 people die in this country every year, cost the U.S. economy $18 billion a year. 1/3 of women over 65, postmenopausal women, will have a vertebral fracture, not caused by injury, but caused by osteoporosis. And polar bears and other hibernating bears have substances in their blood that prevent them from getting osteoporosis. Now, another thing about polar bears, they don't urinate for 5 to 7 months or longer, and yet they don't get toxic, they don't get sick. If we don't get rid of our urinary waste for a few days, we're dead. There is no treatment for end-stage renal disease, for renal failure. The only thing you can do for someone whose kidney is not functioning is to dialyze them, essentially to remove the toxic waste, or to give them a new kidney, to give them a transplant. There's no medication they can take. 8% of Americans, 26 million Americans, have chronic renal disease, and that number is increasing with untreated hypertension and with obesity-related diabetes. Polar bears become massively obese prior to hibernating because they need to live off their body fat. They're eating seal blubber to get that fat. And yet they don't get diabetic. When we become obese, we become diabetic. This is an epidemic disease, not only in the United States, but around the world. There are 500 million people obese around the world, about a little more, a greater proportion of women than men, something like 295 million women, 210 or so million men. Obesity has doubled in the last 30 years in the United States, and it leads to type 2 diabetes, an enormous public health problem. 20 million people have obesity-related diabetes in this country. It kills 250,000 people in this country every year and costs the economy $90 billion. We have no idea how polar bears prevent becoming diabetic, even though they're massively obese. We need to understand that. We have to study them in the wild. They don't hibernate in zoos or in labs. Polar bears have secrets to teach us. And if people understood those connections better, I think they would have a much greater value to biodiversity, to ecosystems, individual species.
We both have to understand that science is telling us that we are losing this diversity of life, and that loss is directly influencing our ability to lead healthy lives.
We, expropriate the whole earth and try to take it all. And so we were the lords of creation. We are not. We're just one of millions of animals.
This is planet Earth, or I like to think of it as planet Ocean, and we have to live within our means. The principle of living within our means applies to ecology just as much as it applies to budgets.
I think it does require immediate action, because the longer we wait, the more severe things will ultimately be.
We are a social primate, and as a social primate, we spend a lot of time paying attention to each other And so I think it's sort of like, you know, a bunch of baboons sitting around grooming each other, you know, while the environmental lion sneaks up. Right? Uh-oh, all of a sudden we should have been doing something about that. Right?
I think people only sometimes, I'm afraid to say, make changes when they feel they have no other choice. And I think it's partly the role of physicians to help them realize they have no other choice, because our health and our lives depend on it.
Airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories, world news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.